This is Faisal Khan for Lights Out, proudly sponsored by Spartans Law, and this is episode 1 of the Monday Night Debate Show. And I'm delighted to be joined by the founder, die-hard and hardcore fan of MMA, Mr. Hammad Mir, who is the founder of the MMA Diagnosis YouTube channel. First of all, good evening to you, Hammad. Thank you very much for taking your time out to join me. How you doing, brother?
Alhamdulillah, I'm good. It's a pleasure to be on here, especially as the first guest of this debate. And I like debates, so I think it'll be a fun show.
Well, fingers crossed. It's a friendly debate, not a heated debate, as we discussed, which is kind of the target. There's going to be no malice intended. There's going to be no hurt intended. Just a fan of the boxing world and a fan of the MMA world, talking about both platforms, trying to, I want to say go at it, but try and agree and disagree to which is the number one sport today. And it's quite an interesting topic when you think about it, because boxing and MMA over the last 5 to 10 years has blown up massively. So I thought, why not make episode 1 based on both sports? Before we dive into the debate, I just wanted to remind the viewers out there, it's a brand new show that we'll be putting on, hopefully, fingers crossed, every Monday. And if you want to know more about our platforms, you can check out our social media platforms. The links are going to be below in the description and obviously below on the page. But more importantly, if you guys can, please, and if you're a hardcore MMA fan, don't forget to check out the MMA Diagnosis YouTube channel and the Instagram page. I've shared it below in the descriptions. It's a very, very good platform to watch. Being an MMA fan myself, I much enjoy Hammad's channel. So guys, if you can, please check out his YouTube channel, check out his Instagram page, hit the subscribe button, hit the follow button. Literally 20 seconds of your time. That's all we're asking for. Right, that's enough niceties. Let's get the gloves on. Let's get in the ring, the octagon, whichever you want. Hammad, first of all, UFC. Where do you think it is right now in terms of how highly ranked boxing is?
UFC and boxing. Okay, so UFC, I see it's not to the level of boxing yet, but I think it's creeping up now. Like from when I first started watching the sport, which was 2008, so I was in school. So I've been having this debate since school. So when I compare it from now to then, like we've got guys now, Conor McGregor, obviously Ronda Rousey, she's in the she was a star. Conor McGregor, we got Habib, and we've got more guys coming up now. Whereas obviously boxing, we got the few stars, Canelo, we got a few stars as well in boxing. But I think MMA is up there now, like with guys like McGregor now. He's transcended the sport, even combat sport. So I think UFC is at a real high, in my opinion. It does need a few more stars, but it's at a real high, and I think over maybe the next 30 years, I think it's gonna surpass boxing maybe within popularity.
Before we agree and disagree, I thought it was important to ask you your thoughts and opinions on where you think UFC is right now, because obviously you have to go back to, I believe it was 1993 for UFC 1, which obviously may seem like a long time ago, but if you go back to boxing history, I mean, boxing is hundreds of years ago is when boxing started. So, as a fan of combat sports, not just boxing, I have to admit UFC is definitely on the up. Not just obviously the UFC. You look at Bellator, Invicta, cage fighting as well. I'm really impressed with how the UFC is at the moment. And the reason why I come up with episode 1 being boxing versus MMA is because I remember someone asked me the question, what is the number one sport right now? And I was thinking to myself, it's a pretty good question to ask. A lot of people are boxing fans, a lot of people are MMA fans, and a lot of people like both sports. Some people like one sport, some people don't like the other sport. It's just how it is. But that's what me and you are going to do today. We're going to talk a bit about both sports. I've come out with 5 points, so we'll start off with the first point of the show. Is we've seen UFC fighters cross over to boxing. Can boxers handle crossing over to the UFC? In other words, can a boxer hang in the octagon? What do you think? Hello? Okay, I think we've had a bit of a technical issue there with Hammad's internet. Hopefully he'll be coming back on. Okay, so we've lost Hammad right now. So obviously I will answer that question for him. I personally think boxers can handle the a crossover to the UFC. We know one of the main points in the UFC is striking in MMA. Yeah, people will say certain fighters like James Toney went over to the UFC, to the MMA, and it didn't really, it didn't really look good. It wasn't a good look for UFC having fighters come into the octagon. But I think overall, when you look at it, as I said, one of the main points is obviously striking, and which is why I kind of enjoyed having having UFC fighters come over to the boxing side of the world. But overall, when you look at it, I just don't think, former MMA fighters, former UFC fighters have really justified their crossover to the boxing world. I mean, we go back to 2017 when Conor McGregor came over to fight Floyd Mayweather, which obviously was a big spectacle for all fight fans. But if you look at it in hindsight, overall, it wasn't a good performance. It never really stood out. It just never delivered. Obviously, the build up to it was fascinating. Seeing the world press tour that they did. But when you look at McGregor's boxing skills, it wasn't a good sight for boxing. One thing we've had is, as of late, is we've seen a lot of MMA fighters get into the boxing ring. Previously, we saw former UFC world champion Tyrone Woodley fight celebrity YouTube star Jake Paul on 2 occasions. And watching both of those fights, it just wasn't. I can understand it from a business point of view. It wasn't really good to watch. I never really enjoyed watching Tyrone Woodley versus Jake Paul. I thought Tyrone Woodley's boxing skills were very bad. We've also seen other fighters do it. We've seen Anderson Gibb. We've seen Frank Mir. We're all going to remember his boxing. It's a different ball game. But we've not seen too many of boxers go over to the UFC. And quite frankly, why I think boxers can handle the UFC more is obviously it's shorter rounds and it's a shorter fight. And as I said, boxing is, striking in the UFC, it's a big part of the MMA world is striking. So I do think, we've seen, we've seen Tyson Fury train with one of the Diaz brothers over the last couple of months. It is something that could possibly happen. Whether it does happen is a different case. So, look, 100%, it would be interesting to see. We've seen boxers come over to we've seen UFC fighters come over to the boxing world, but as for the boxers to go over to the MMA, it's something that I think really would be interesting to see. Point number 2: boxing and MMA, which has the best build-up and coverage? This is one where I have to give it to the UFC. I think, their press conferences and, of course, their face-offs are really interesting. One of the best press conferences I enjoyed from the UFC, the MMA, was quite recently when you had Tony Ferguson kind of go a cappella and use a few lyrics of Mask Off to kind of taunt Dana White. And one thing I really do enjoy, and one thing I feel which makes a good press conference, is a bit of back and forth. And you always see that in the UFC press conferences, and you always see that in the UFC face-offs. So which is why I kind of really do enjoy a good coverage build up to a UFC show. And I've got to say, when you've got someone like Conor McGregor in one of these press conferences, whether it's, a build up to a world title fight, or whether it's a build up to one of the 3 fights with Dustin Poirier, or the big build up to the Khabib fight, is always going to be entertaining, regardless of what he says. Some people find him offensive, some people find him entertaining. But I do think when you've got someone like Conor McGregor on the show, it really does make for an interesting one. Right. So Hammad has rejoined us. Hammad, don't worry about it. Bad internet connection problems. We've all unfortunately, we've all been through it before. So let's go back to point number 1, which obviously we've seen UFC fighters cross over to boxing. Do you think boxers can handle it in the UFC, the MMA world?
Okay, so I'm glad you asked that, because about 10 years ago, I don't know, I must have been like 15 years old. A man named James Lights Out Tony, same name as your podcast. So he came into MMA. He fought a guy older than him, Randy Couture. Okay, we can make an argument. he wasn't in the best shape or things like that. But he thought, I'm wearing 4-ounce gloves. I can, catch a MMA fighter. They won't be able to get a takedown on me. And then we saw the fight with Randy Couture. He got choked out within the first round. Personally, I think I don't think boxers, if it's their first fight, okay, if they have a proper training camp and they can maybe cross over to the UFC, I don't know. Maybe a smaller promotion, they're going to have to go through the ranks like that. I don't think, I think a boxer will generally lose due to the lack of grappling.
Obviously, when you lost your internet connection, I mentioned about James Toney's crossover when he fought Randy Couture,
Okay.
And I did put on notice that it wasn't a happy occasion for James Lights Out Toney, excuse the pun. But I think, look, what you got to remember is that it's something we've not seen a lot of. Whereas we've seen a lot of UFC MMA fighters come over to boxing, and it's very rare that I've turned around and said, or any other boxing pundit or fan has said, you know what, it was actually worth the decision in the end. I mean, when you look back at the two fights between Jake Paul and Tyron Woodley, bad performances from both fighters, don't get me wrong, but you would expect a lot more better from Tyron Woodley, seeing as how many times has he been a world champion in the UFC? Was it 4 or 5 times?
Yeah, 4 times he's defended the belt. Yeah, it is quite embarrassing, but I'm going to make another argument now. Obviously, we just saw Anderson Silva beat Chavez Jr. So Anderson Silva's an old guy, and he's one of the top strikers in MMA. So, and Chavez Jr. is a former world champion. If I had to switch the roles now and have maybe someone like, who would be a good name, someone big in boxing like Canelo, someone come into MMA and fight a former MMA world champion in an MMA fight, I don't think he would win.
As I mentioned, what I said about MMA is one of the main attributes is striking, and obviously for me the biggest appointment is seeing the style of punching. When you had Conor McGregor and Tyron Woodley, their punching for me was horrendous. And obviously, when you talk about boxing, when somebody predicts a fight in boxing, they always say anyone's got a puncher's chance, which is why you would have thought McGregor had a slight chance against Floyd Mayweather. Not a big chance, but a slight chance, and which is why you would have thought Tyron Woodley, being a former world champion, he's got a puncher's chance against Jake Paul. Not just obviously Tyron Woodley, but you also look at Anderson Gibb, Frank Mir, you just said Anderson Silva as well. I do believe if anyone could throw a punch, they could win a fight. But yes, you mentioned Anderson Silva beating Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. But if you look back at that fight, it wasn't a really good fight, was it? It's very. I've not really been impressed seeing the crossovers from the MMA fighters. But listen, most MMA fighters, we both know their main attributes are grappling, get them into submission holds. Can a boxer do that? Maybe not. But can a boxer punch? 100%. Should an MMA fighter be able to have a better punch on him? I believe 100%. But we can argue about that all day long. We'll move on to point number 2. Which sport, boxing or MMA, has the best build-ups and coverage? I'll let you answer that first.
I think, personally, I think MMA. I think the way, if you look at the UFC, the way they do the countdowns, and then we got the embedded, and then the coverage, ESPN, BT Sport, it's everywhere. It's plastered everywhere. And I feel like boxing still it's good, but I feel like sometimes I don't even hear about a fight. I find out so late. Like, I feel like the coverage is not as much. I mean, we've got Conor Brook now, but like even then, like when I compare it to the MMA coverage, I still feel like boxing is not as good in my opinion. Like the way the build up, like for example, McGregor and Habib, and the storyline, and showing each character, and the press conferences, even the way the press conferences are done, is I feel like it's so much better in MMA. I feel like the boxing press conferences, they're good, but just giving the fighter time to talk. And whereas in MMA, the journalists get to ask all the questions, and then you get a bit of rivalry. I feel like MMA has better build-ups and coverage, in my opinion.
I can't disagree with what you've just said about the coverage for the big build-ups in any of the big UFC shows. I mean, I said that I even enjoy watching the press conferences that the UFC put on. You know, the face-offs are really, really exciting because they could just pop off at any minute. And I did say when you got fighters like, you know, one of my best press conferences that I've watched recently in the UFC world is when Tony Ferguson started using lyrics off a song and he started aiming them towards Dana White when he talked about Dana White privilege. You know, it's just stuff like that you don't really get in boxing. And as I've always said, if you want to entertain a press conference in the UFC, you definitely tune into Conor McGregor, whether you agree with some of the stuff that he says or not. The build up, you know, the coverage that ESPN, BT Sport that they put on is second to none. And I do think that is where probably, you know, the UFC side of the sport has one up on boxing. Don't get me wrong, you know, boxing can always improve and so can MMA, but I do feel boxing needs to sort of improve a lot more in terms of its coverage and its build up. But one thing I will say is when you talk about the big fights, not just in boxing, but you also talk in MMA, I do believe that if tomorrow we got the announcement that there's a rematch between Joshua versus Usyk, and you got an announcement the following day that there's a rematch between, let's say, Conor McGregor and Khabib, I still think that Joshua Usyk 2 gets more recognition than Khabib versus Conor McGregor 2. Hear me out, and I'll tell you why. Because at the moment, Conor McGregor is a cash cow. There's no disagreeing that he is going to go down as arguably one of the biggest faces of all time in MMA history. But how many fighters can you say will go down in MMA history because of not only what they've achieved inside the ring, but also outside of the ring? Yeah, don't get me wrong, you've got some big faces over there in the UFC stroke MMA, but I just feel that boxing, there's so many characters, there's so many names that kind of outdoes the UFC side of things. Would you agree?
Okay. But where from now? If I walk down the road now and I go McGregor and Khabib and Joshua and Usyk, I put money. I don't know which generation we're talking about, because the old heads, they prefer the boxing. But if I'm talking about my generation and younger, everyone's going to be talking more about McGregor and Khabib, in my opinion. Like if I were to just walk down the street right now. So in my opinion, even the pay-per-view buys reflect my statement, I believe. I don't believe pay-per-view wise Joshua and Usyk will sell as much as McGregor and Khabib, especially in a rematch.
Maybe not, but I'll have to give a point across to you. If you went and asked combat sport fans right now, Fury versus Wilder or Ngannou versus John Jones, they would say Fury versus Wilder, because for me, there's a couple of divisions in UFC that are really good. Then there's a few divisions in the UFC that don't have that much appeal to it. If you look at boxing, you've got a number of divisions which are exciting, from welterweight all the way up to heavyweight. So I do feel as if that's where MMA could improve on. You know, I mean, from what I'm hearing and from what I'm reading, a lot of these fighters are getting paid below the $1 million mark, which is where I think UFC needs to improve, and which is why I think you're getting a lot of UFC fighters moving over to boxing these days. And listen, don't get me wrong, everybody's entitled to go make their money whichever way they feel is necessary. But yes, the lightweight division right now in UFC is really, really exciting. And it was good to see at the start of last year, as Israel Adesanya go up a weight. But I think if you want to improve UFC right now, you have to make the weights such as the heavyweight division. You've got to really put some excitement. You've got to put some juice on that, a bit more meat on the bones, if you know what I say. Anthony Joshua, Conor McGregor. Now, I chose these two because I do believe these two are the biggest stars in boxing and MMA right now. And I do believe Conor McGregor is going to be globally one of the biggest sports stars in the world, probably of all time. And again, people have their opinions on Joshua and people have their opinions on McGregor. But you and I will both agree on this, surely, that they globally are massive all over the world right now. Why do you think Conor McGregor is bigger than Anthony Joshua?
Okay, McGregor now. He's in line with celebrities. I feel like, obviously Joshua as well, but I feel like even if we compare the Instagram followers, I'm sure McGregor has more. I don't even need to check right now. I believe he has more. Even coverage-wise, and he's been praised by like celebrities. He's transcended MMA, in my opinion. McGregor, he's got control even in the UFC, which is unheard of. Like, because UFC is kind of, it's where in boxing you have the Ali Act and you can do your own promotion and things like that. McGregor created that for himself, literally within the UFC. Even his pay-per-view buys. He's done the second highest pay-per-view buy in boxing. Forget MMA, in boxing, he's done the second. Mayweather and McGregor was the second highest behind Mayweather and Pacquiao. So Joshua, I don't know why. Maybe in the UK, Joshua can handle his own. Like, people know about both of them in the UK. But if we talk about globally, I think McGregor is the biggest star. Like, if we look at everything globally, especially now with Joshua, even with both losing, I still think McGregor is the biggest star, in my opinion.
I think globally, McGregor is huge. You know, I believe he sells his own whiskey brand. You know, he's got a huge following. I don't disagree with you on that. But come on, McGregor's last win was what, in the Obama era, wasn't it? Right? You know, yes, Anthony Joshua. Listen, Anthony Joshua just lost his last fight against Alexander Usyk, so I shouldn't be really bigging up who's won and who's lost. But you know, if you talk about legacy, like real supremacy in sports, these two are definitely up there. You know, Conor McGregor, multiple weight division world champion, Anthony Joshua, two-time world champion, former Olympic gold medalist. But I felt that at the time when AJ come into boxing was UK boxing especially, I felt it was lacking something. I felt it was lacking that extra bit of spark. I felt it was lacking that one face who could really blow onto the scene and just sort of get the people falling in love with the sport again. Don't get me wrong, boxing's always had an appeal, but I just felt it lacked that bit of spark. And I think when Anthony Joshua come into boxing, especially the professional side of boxing kind of found its belief again that it was on the up. And I've got a ton of respect for Conor McGregor as a fighter and for what he's achieved. But I just feel that build up to the Khabib fight lost a lot of respect for him. I'm not going to obviously go over by what they said, you know, during the press conference and the build up to the fight. I just feel the attack on the UFC boss and some of the things he said, I just think he went a bit too political. And don't get me wrong, we love a bit of controversy in any sport. You know, it's what kind of makes sell the fight, if you know what I'm talking about. But I think with Anthony Joshua, he's got that bit of humbleness to him, as he likes to say. He always likes to stay humble. He always likes to stay calm. He always likes to stay positive. But I just think if you were comparing them as role models and you had a young child at home and you wanted them to watch somebody, you would pick Anthony Joshua, because Conor McGregor, not only is he a great fighter, but he's also a real bad mouth talker. He will F and blind. He will go to all certain levels in press conferences. He don't give a shit who it is. He will look to tear into anybody, and this is why people love Conor McGregor. And to some extent, I actually enjoy watching Conor McGregor, but I do think sometimes Conor McGregor does like to go a little bit over the top. But as I said, that sells to some people, that doesn't sell to some people. You think Conor McGregor is a bigger name globally? Yes, I think he's a bigger name globally, but I certainly think Anthony Joshua right now has more appeal to him than Conor McGregor. But that's obviously just my opinion, and this is why it's a debate, and this is why we are brought in an MMA platform today. You're going to give your opinion, I'm going to give you my opinion. They're two of the biggest stars in the sports right now. But who's the number one promoter right now? Eddie Hearn or Dana White? Before you answer that question, what do you think the difference between Dana White and Eddie Hearn is right now?
What's the difference? I think Dana gives less shits about like the way he carries himself. He just says whatever, and he's not trying to be too, you know, he's not trying to be too how do I put it? Too what's the word? He's not trying to be too
professional.
Corporate. He's not trying to be too corporate. Like, he's not trying to be, you know, Dana's like, you know, he says crazy things. If you look at his Instagram, he calls out fans. On Twitter, he's just a crazy guy. He's a rich guy, crazy guy. I mean, a better promoter now. him and Eddie Hearn. Eddie Hearn has done a lot. Like, he's made boxing a lot more interesting from when I grew up to watching boxing, and like till now. Like, Eddie Hearn has done a lot for the sport of boxing, especially British boxing. So I gotta commend him on that. But the better promoter, I mean, Eddie Hearn said it himself, we need to follow the UFC model, get boxing bigger. So I don't know. He's answered that himself, like basically insinuating Dana's what the promotion Dana's doing. We need to get to that level.
Yeah, I think Dana White has done tremendously well for UFC. You look at the caliber of fights he's put on over the last few years. You know, some of the events he's organized. You know, globally, the UFC is a massive name, and it's a sport that people love. It's a sport that people enjoy. They put more and more shows on. You know, even UFC Las Vegas. I've watched a few of their shows, and I have to say I'm really impressed as well. And look, just because it's a debate between boxing and MMA, I'm not going to sit here and knock MMA. No chance. You know, for the last couple of years, I've taken a massive interest in it. But however, I do feel that Dana White is more on the up, because if you look at the UFC right now, it is run by one face, and that is Dana White. You know, but boxing, you've got a number of faces, whether that's Eddie Hearn, Frank Warren, Al Heyman, you know, Bob Arum, and there's hundreds of local managers and promoters in the UK that you and I have never even heard of. So one thing that I think Eddie Hearn's lacked on in the last couple of years is he's not delivered on a few big fights that he was confident of making, i.e. Fury versus Joshua, Joshua versus Wilder. You know, even though Conor and Brook is happening right now, he always insisted he will be the man that makes Conor versus Brook many, many years ago. So I do think this is where Eddie Hearn has kind of, I wouldn't say let himself down a bit, but all right, he's let himself down a little bit. He's not delivered on those big fights that fans have called out for. But again, as I said, he's got to do a lot of work in boxing. So if tomorrow, let's say Joshua wins the rematch versus Usyk, the number one fight to make is Joshua versus Fury. He can't just go over to Tyson Fury and say, here's $60 million, fight Anthony Joshua in December in Saudi Arabia for all the belts. It's a done deal. It doesn't work like that. He has to go direct to Tyson Fury's promoter, which is Frank Warren and Bob Arum, and he has to say to them, let's make the fight happen. And then he's got to give an offer, and then he's got to find a bunch of people that are interested in paying for the fight. He's got to find a venue for the fight. You see what I'm trying to say? Boxing's a little bit more complicated. However, I do feel if boxing was run by one man, i.e. Eddie Hearn, where he ran boxing as one platform, you know, boxing's got Matchroom, DAZN, you've got Sky Sports, you've got BT Sports, you've got Top Rank, you've got Showtime. If you sort of scrapped all of those platforms and you made it into one, I believe Eddie Hearn would probably go down as the greatest promoter of all time. But at the moment, you can't knock what Dana White's doing, but you also kind of cannot knock what Eddie Hearn is doing. I mean, you look at some of the talent he's given boxing over the last few years, and there's a number of fighters that haven't even become world champion. And this is why I think the next 2 or 3 years, boxing kind of outshines MMA. But why I respect him a little bit more than Dana White is because of what he said about the MMA and the UFC. They need to copy the sort of model of the UFC. They need to look at what the UFC's doing differently. And if we had someone like a Dana White a lot more involved in boxing, working closely with Eddie Hearn, I think boxing would be 10 times better than it is right now. Final point of the debate, boxing versus MMA, which is the number one sport? Hammad, go for it, bro. Why do you believe MMA is the number one sport right now?
Okay, my argument is gonna be quite holistic. So I'm gonna look at different factors now. So obviously, I believe it's easier to follow MMA. So like we have the UFC, we got the rankings. You know, there's no IBF, WBA, WBO. I know because I've interviewed a few boxers, so I know how it works. Like, you know, if I want to see, for example, now Hamza Shiraz where he's at in MMA, it would be a lot more easier for me to find out where he's at and how far he's got left till he's fighting for a world title. Another thing, the fights now. MMA, oh, we want to see this fight. More than likely, it will happen. There's a more chance that they'll fight in their prime. For example, Mayweather and Pacquiao was just a letdown. Like, it happened so late. And these super big fights that everyone's looking for. Boxing has improved, though. I'm going to give them that. They have improved a lot since 10 years ago. So MMA, I'll say, has an advantage over that as well. Another thing, women's MMA and women's boxing now. Women's MMA just outshines women's boxing so much that your best boxer in women's, the best boxer in women's boxing, Clarissa Shields, came into PFL and fought, and she did well. She lost the second fight, of course, but she you know, she had to come into MMA to be shown love and like support from the boxing side. That's where I feel like boxing is lacking as well. Women's boxing, they could improve a lot more on that. Another thing, even if we look at like movies now, we're seeing arm bars, we're seeing John Wick, we're seeing all these kind of things. Whereas back in the day, it was more the tough guy was the boxer. But nowadays, we're seeing the tough guys, you know, doing basically MMA. We've seen even like Gina Carano, women's MMA. She's in all these big movies and big shows. George St. Pierre, Captain America, Ronda Rousey. We're seeing more and more of that now. I don't see as many boxers in these movies. I think Francis Ngannou was in Fast and Furious, I believe. So little things like that, I believe. And we're gonna go to the basic one now. Number one sport. If we put a boxer and MMA in a cage or a ring, who comes out on top? I'm gonna say 9 out of 10 times the MMA guy. I'm gonna give the puncher's chance to the boxer, the one, but yeah, I say my argument will. I think that's why I believe overall, when I look at it holistically, MMA is the number one sport over boxing.
Obviously, I have to argue against that. Again, no malice intended, no hatred intended. Just two fans that love the sports. Again, with all due respect to the UFC stroke MMA, I have to say boxing is the number one sport because I believe there's more money pumped into it. You know, when there's a big fight in boxing, everyone knows about it. I mean, it was only a couple of weeks ago we saw Poirier versus Oliveira. I just don't think it had that much of appeal of a hype to it. It should have had a hype to it, given the fact that Poirier had come off of beating Conor McGregor twice, and given the fact that Oliveira, ended the long wait to become a world champion and defeated Michael Chandler the way he did. So I just think that whenever there's a big fight in boxing, or whenever there's a big fight in the UFC, boxing goes to another level in terms of how it's promoted, how it gets out there, and it sells a lot more than UFC pay-per-view buyers do. Boxers make more money, you know. And these days it's not just promoters, and it's not just ticket sales, it's not just pay-per-view buys. You know, you've got everybody in the world right now that is just jumping on boxing, and of course the MMA as well. I mean, we've seen on the UFC Fight Island how the people over in Saudi Arabia are involved with the sport of MMA, but they also like that with the sport of boxing. And I do personally believe, right, that boxing in Saudi Arabia over the next few years is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. I can't really say about MMA because I don't look too much into that side of the sport, if you know what I mean, i.e. who's looking to invest in the MMA, i.e. who's looking to put money down for future fights, such as maybe Oliveira's next fight or Conor McGregor's next fight or whoever's fighting next. But I do know there's a number of people interested in a potential undisputed clash between Tyson Fury and Alexander Usyk. I do know a lot of people around the world want to see Canelo come and fight in their country. Again, why I think boxing is better is because we've proven when MMA fighters come over to boxing, they can't handle the boxing side of things, i.e. the endurance of a boxing match, i.e. they can't throw a punch properly. And bro, this is no disrespect to the UFC, to the MMA, bro. I love UFC and MMA to bits. I love watching it. I love reading on it. I can go back and watch previous fights. I still, till this day, watch the build-up to Khabib and Conor McGregor. I still watch Dustin Poirier's fight with Justin Gaethje, the war that it was. I can go back and watch classic fights all day long, but I will say that boxing is completely on another level to the MMA right now because the MMA and UFC fighters have come over here and they've left a sour taste in the MMA fans. You got fighters like Tyron Woodley coming over to boxing right now, and he's getting knocked out by a celebrity star called Jake Paul. Now, don't get me wrong. If Tommy Fury gets knocked out by Jake Paul or Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. gets knocked out by Jake Paul, that is going to be a massive downer for boxing because these are guys that are coming from boxing families Cesar Chavez Jr.'s old man is a boxing legend, and Tommy Fury is the younger brother of current heavyweight champion Tyson Fury. So don't get me wrong, I think it's backfired for MMA fans. Their fighters coming over to boxing, but it could massively backfire for the professional fighters if they go down and lose to somebody like Jake Paul, who's a celebrity star, never started out to be a boxer, never will be known as a boxer, in my opinion. And it's only just a matter of time before a boxer sends him back to vlogging and showing videos of dead bodies, which is what he was good for. Never going to be a boxer. But listen, fair play to him. He's doing what he has to do. But those are the reasons why I believe boxing is a bigger sport right now.
You don't think it's embarrassing that Mayweather couldn't finish Logan Paul? Like, you don't think that's... Because if that was the other way around in MMA, he would have been finished in the first round. I think Mayweather done a disservice to boxing by not finishing.
I think what we have to remember is that Floyd Mayweather's how old now? What is he? 44 years old. 44 years old.
But if you're TBE and you can't finish a YouTuber, then I don't know, man.
I listen. You got a point, but at the end of the day, that was an exhibition. You know, you seen there was a certain point in that fight exhibition, where he hits Logan Paul and he kind of keeps Logan Paul up. You know, it was it's Floyd Mayweather. You know, I think a lot of the whole hoo-ha before the fight between him and Logan's brother Jake, I think a lot of it was staged. Personally, that's what I believe. Yeah. And I do think if Floyd wanted to, he could have knocked out Logan Paul. But this is what I'm saying. You know, there's boxing, in my opinion, can become on the end of a huge backlash if an MMA fighter was to come over and beat one of boxing's top stars, or if Jake Paul carries on this run that he's on and he knocks out a Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., or he was to go and knock out a Tommy Fury. You know, I know last week that there was a bit of back and forth between Dana White and Jake Paul over Twitter and Instagram, but if an Jorge Masvidal or a Nate Diaz or a Conor McGregor was to fight Jake Paul and they were to lose, I personally believe it massively damages their reputation.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't think they will lose, though, in my opinion. I don't think they will lose to Jake Paul, but because they're the better strikers, in my opinion, they can actually box. Nate Diaz just trained with Andre Ward. Jorge Masvidal has trained with a lot of professional boxers. These guys can actually box. Woodley, I wouldn't consider him a top striker in MMA. He's on the lower end. He's wrestling and his explosiveness. And another argument I'm going to make, you talked about the endurance. I believe a boxer wouldn't be able to handle the endurance in an MMA fight as well. They're two different things, because I don't know if you've grappled before. Have you done striking or grappling?
I've done a little bit of grappling. Okay.
I've done both. And I've competed in striking and grappling. So I know there's a big difference in endurance, the way you train yourself. They're two different kind of things. So I do hear a lot of boxing fans use that argument, and I'm like, in 1-2 rounds, a boxer wouldn't be able to even lift their arm up if they did an MMA fight, in my opinion. They'll be gassed out because of the grappling, and it's like two different things. One's anaerobic and aerobic at the same time. So I
think what you've got to remember is that in both MMA and boxing, you've got to be perfect for every second of the round, because an MMA fight 100%. And a boxing fight can change within any second. And again, it's no disrespect to the MMA, but I also believe a boxer struggles as well if he goes over into the octagon and fights for 5-minute rounds, where not only is there punching allowed, there's also grappling, submission holds, holds against the cage, stuff like that. But listen, it's interesting to see. Before obviously we end the debate, we've kind of like gone to the more or less calmness side of it now. What does boxing need to do to improve, and what does MMA need to do to improve? I'll obviously go first. I think MMA is a phenomenal sport right now. The platform is growing, but as I mentioned that when a few weeks ago we had Poirier versus Oliveira, a world title fight. That was Oliveira's first world title defense, and that was Poirier, I believe, it was his second shot at a world title. It's a world title fight. I do believe promotion-wise, they've got to get more people involved. They've got to have more, like I said, if you knew Joshua and Usyk were fighting in 2 weeks' time, you knew they were fighting. A lot of people that I know that are combat sport fans didn't even know that fight was on the week of the fight when I mentioned it to them. So that's where I do feel as if UFC need to improve. They've got to sort of move away from these big names and promote these other fighters that are coming up into the UFC right now a lot better. They've got to sort of get with today's program rather than yesterday's program, because I feel it's kind of disrespectful that when people say Oliveira's next fight should be against Conor McGregor, I'm not being funny or anything, but Conor McGregor's lost his last 2 fights. And as I said, Conor McGregor's last win was in the Obama era, which was a very, very long time ago. You know, there's other great fighters in that division, you know, that would give Oliveira a good fight. I'm hearing that Justin Gaethje right now is supposedly his next mandatory challenger. What do you think boxing could do to improve?
Boxing to improve, I would say give the fights, put the fights on that people want to see on time. Don't be you know, delaying it. We see that a lot. It's improved though. It's improved a lot, but it's still annoying when you have to wait 1 year to see Fury and someone else. And whereas in MMA, we'll see it within a couple of months. I think another thing they could improve on is definitely the press conferences. I don't get any thrill from it. Like, I don't like the layout, but maybe because I'm so used to MMA, I don't know. Maybe boxing fans enjoy that layout, but I do believe the MMA layout is much better within press conferences and media in that sense. What else could boxing improve on? Okay, I think these circus fights like Jake Paul, stuff like that, giving guys like that a big platform. I mean, it waters down the sport a bit. I mean, we are seeing MMA guys coming over. So the one area where I believe MMA could improve on definitely is the salary, the pay for the fighters, fighter pay. Definitely need to improve on that. Also with boxing, I think those cards generally they're not that stacked. Generally, you got 1 or 2 fights maybe to focus on. Like whereas in MMA, I do feel like when they do put a big card on, there's a few fights that are stacked. Like for example, the Poirier and Oliveira, and then we had the Chandler and Gaethje. They were just like amazing different fights. These little things, I think, if boxing adds that, it'll be even more bigger and better.
No, listen, when you mentioned the point about stacking out cards, I agree with you as well. But unfortunately, I made a point earlier on in this debate that you've got different number of platforms and different number of promoters. We'd all love to see on one card Tyson Fury versus Anthony Joshua, and then we'd all love to see, I don't know, Canelo Golovkin free. You'd all love to see it on one card, but unfortunately, boxing these days, when it's a pay-per-view card, people are mainly paying for the main event. But I will say this as an MMA fan, when it's a pay-per-view show, people are paying for the whole card. And when you look at the term pay-per-view next to a card in boxing, the first question I ask is, all right, who's on the undercard? Is there any other world title fights? Is there any true 50-50 fights on that card? One thing I will say about MMA is when they put on a pay-per-view card, they put on a fucking good show. I mean, they put on a brilliant show. I can't knock that. And that's where I think boxing could improve as well. I think listen, if the best promoter in the world right now, Eddie Hearn, is coming out and saying we need to follow the MMA brand and copy sort of what they're doing, then I can't turn around and be like, no, he's talking rubbish, because I do feel there are certain things that the MMA are doing right now that are a lot better than boxing. But again, listen, everyone's got their opinion. Everyone's got their own preferences to what they like, whether it's the boxing or the MMA. But this is why it's called the Monday Night Debate Show, because that's what we're going to be doing a lot more of in the future. Hammad, before we bring the debate to an end, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, I'll just end it with I enjoy both sports. I think they're both it's a fun time right now in both sports. I felt like at one point, like maybe boxing was lacking or MMA was lacking, but when I was seeing both sports getting massive and like it's just general conversation now, like both sports. And I'm enjoying like what Eddie Hearn's doing and all these promoters now with DAZN and all these different platforms. I'm liking combat sports right now. I'm gonna end it with that. And
yeah, well, listen, I'll end it with simply both sports are really, really entertaining. Yes, there's a bit of controversy in both sports, and we don't always get what we want with both sports, but this is a real good time to be a combat sports fan. And, even amateur boxing, they can, we could see them improve in terms of amateur fighting. Invicta, Bellator, Cage Warriors are getting their own platforms now, whether that's on Fight TV or whether that's through another type of broadcast. But I do feel as if that boxing can improve with the amateur side of things and bringing up the next crop of fighters. However, MMA is really impressive when it comes to the platforms below the UFC, because Bellator, I believe it gets broadcasted on the BBC now, right?
The BBC iPlayer, and it's on Showtime as well in America.
Exactly. So it wasn't just much of a debate where I sit here and tell you what's wrong with the MMA, and you tell me what's wrong with boxing. I give MMA a massive praise today, and I'm a big fan of the sport, and I can tell just by speaking to you today, you're also a huge fan of boxing, which is good, because we all live in a world where we want to see the best fights and we want to see the best promoters and we want to enjoy the next 30, 40 years in combat sports. But that's all we've got time for today, people. Hammad, much appreciated you jumping on and joining us today. Really, really enjoyed having you on. And hopefully next time where we have a debate where it's based on the MMA, or we might even have to test your boxing knowledge, we'll definitely be looking forward to having you on again. So thank you so much for coming on today.
Yeah, thank you, my brother. And is it all right if I give a shout out? So,
go for it, bro. Go for it.
If you like MMA, if you like, I'm gonna have boxes on as well. Check out my channel, MMA Diagnosis. Check us on out all social media platforms and all audio platforms. I'm one of the few guys representing my community in mixed martial arts journalism. I think I am the only guy. I've been doing press conferences for Bellator, PFL, One Championship. So yeah, check us out.
You're not one of the only guys. You are the guy representing.
Yeah, I'm the only guy. Yeah,
mixed martial arts. One of the only mixed martial arts Asian guys out there. But listen, as Hammad said, check out his platforms. Check him out on all the audio platforms as well. We've shared most of his descriptions below in the link. So make sure you hit the subscribe button on his YouTube channel. Give him a follow on his Instagram account. Both links are below in the description. And if you haven't already, please make sure you hit that subscribe button. Make sure you hit the bell for further notifications. Check us out on all the social media platforms. And we look forward to seeing you guys next week for episode 2 of the Monday Night Debate Show. Hammad, thank you very much for watching. And to the viewers out there, thank you very much for watching episode 1 of the Lights Out Boxing Monday Night Debate Show.
Thank you.